The Hobbit trilogy earned $3 billion, but made one critical mistake. You see, while the Hobbit films helped Tolkien's story reach the ends of the earth, it alienated the core audience who knew the original story. Because if you didn't know, the book and movies are entirely different. Bilbo goes on a journey with Thorin's company, and that's pretty much where the similarities stop. And after reading and watching both versions of this epic adventure many times, I thought it was officially time for someone to sit down and document what those crucial changes between these two formats actually are. Which characters were removed or added? What plot points got warped or revised to fit the film format? Were the locations accurate, and how did it impact the story? These are just a few of the questions I want to address as I go scene by scene and page by page through the book and movies to find every single change. And in this video, we'll kick things off by covering all the changes regarding the first chapter of the book across 4 major categories: characters, timeline, location, and plot. So sit back, grab a cup of tea, and relax as we head into episode 1 of Movies vs. Manuscripts, the Hobbit Edition. As always in this series, we need to begin our analysis by reviewing what the film's version of events were. And because Peter Jackson decided to turn a children's novel into 3 massive movies, that means what we're covering today is 40 minutes long in the movie. That's right, one single chapter was extended to fill 40 full minutes. You might think that means they could have made it accurate because they easily could have fit all the original dialogue and scenes, but you'd be mistaken. No, there are just about 16 different changes to the plot, which we'll cover later. But anyway, without going word for word through these scenes, here's a brief refresher. To start, we see Bilbo, old Bilbo that is, beginning to write in his red book the entire account of his journey. And this includes sharing the fate of Dale and Erebor as Smaug takes over the mountain. We learn about who Thorin is, the finding of the Arkenstone, and the betrayal of the elves. Then there's a fun little cameo from Elijah Wood as Frodo, and then finally the movie goes back in time to when Bilbo was in his 50s, smoking on his bench out front. Gandalf comes up and talks with him, and Bilbo runs inside after the wizard insinuates that he's signed him up for an adventure. Then after a brief extended edition scene of Bilbo going to a market, paranoid about Gandalf, we cut to nighttime as he prepares his supper. Dwarves begin to show up one by one, with Gandalf eventually arriving as well. And then we get the rowdy dinner scene and the iconic cleaning song. Finally, Thorin arrives, and the dwarves get down to business, ending with Bilbo passing out as he gets lumped into this adventure as their burglar. He completely refuses to participate though, and the dwarves somberly sing a song about their homeland and then go to bed. And that's where this 40-minute section ends, and our analysis begins. Obviously, I skipped over a lot of detail, but we'll get to those crucial elements during the changes. And speaking of which, let's begin by looking at our first 3 categories, which are usually smaller, and those are characters, timeline, and locations. Thankfully this week, location gets a pass as everything occurs within Bag End or the Shire itself. Then for timeline, there's only one notable difference, and that is simply that the dwarves actually arrive at tea time and stay all evening. They speak for hours and hours after playing music and go to bed late. The movie switches around the order of these events, but more specifically, the dwarves don't arrive until the evening in the movie. This, thankfully, is a simple change, but we didn't get so lucky for our characters category. Regarding characters, there are multiple crucial changes that will ripple out and impact the rest of this film trilogy. So it's key to note them down here at the beginning of this series. First, we need to communicate the massive difference in the dwarves' ages. I won't go through all 13, but a good reference point and perhaps the most impactful change is Thorin's age. Before I reveal his age, go ahead and in the comments let me know how old you think he is based on the movie. Are you ready? Well, I can almost guarantee that you are wrong if you had no prior knowledge of his age, because in the book, he is 195 years old. Something that's never really communicated in the films is that the dwarves live for a few hundred years typically, and the events of Erebor happened a long time ago. Now technically in the movie, there is a point at which Thorin says the dragon Smaug has not been seen for 60 years. So this could explain away this timeline issue. But it doesn't explain why Thorin looks like a GQ model at the ripe age of 195, which could be a character change in and of itself, I guess, as we all know that the dwarves, some of them at least, don't really look like dwarves, but I'm sure we'll get into that in a future episode. Anyway, moving on to the other character changes, we have a few incorrect additions, some of which massively impact the future of this story. First, on a smaller note, Dain, the Lord of the Iron Hills, isn't actually mentioned until much later in the book. And Frodo isn't included either, despite being shown as a cameo in this trilogy. But as for the big changes, we have 3 key characters who contribute to the film's plot in major ways: Azog the Defiler, the Necromancer, and Thranduil. Here's the interesting thing. Azog is dead during the events of this book in Tolkien's lore. In fact, Dain from the Iron Hills beheaded him many years prior. As for the Necromancer, that spawns a whole subplot in the movie that never exists in the book. Gandalf had already found Thrain captive by the time the events of The Hobbit took place, not at the same time like the movies will show. Again, that's something that I'm sure we'll get into much later in this series. And lastly, Thranduil is never named in the entire Hobbit book. That's right, Tolkien simply refers to him as the Elven King. He isn't given a name until the Lord of the Rings books. So, as you can see, we're set up for quite the time as we analyze these 3 films, because right off the bat, we have 3 of the most prominent characters not participating in the way the movie shows, or just not existing in the story of The Hobbit whatsoever. Fun, right? Well, if you like that, then you'll love the next section as we dive into all of the plot changes. But first, I wanted to shout out Jason, Jacob, Cody, and all my other incredible Patreon supporters who make videos like this possible every month. If you want to join and participate in fun community discussions, content decisions like thumbnails and titles, and more, you can check it out using the link in the description. Also, I need to clarify that I typically steer clear of going word for word through dialogue, because let's be real, no movie is copying exactly what the book conversations are like. But if there is a bit of dialogue that significantly changes or alters the plot, I'll do my best to mention it. Now that being said, let's jump into the plot changes. To begin our analysis of every change to the story itself, we of course need to take a look at The Hobbit's opening scene, which showcases a flashback of Dale and Erebor. Obviously, this exact flashback isn't present at the beginning of the book, but that's not what I consider the first change, because technically we do learn about the events of Smaug's attack later in this chapter, with more details trickling in throughout the entire book. But buried inside this memory are multiple errors that I cannot overlook. First, the backstory of Thranduil's relationship with the dwarves seems to be fabricated for this trilogy. Like I mentioned earlier, Thranduil himself is only referred to as the Elven King in the book, and we don't really get a backstory for him. The movie embellishes on Thranduil's connection to the jewels under the mountain, and as far as I'm aware, the whole sub-story of those being his wife's jewels doesn't show up anywhere in Tolkien's text. Now, I could be wrong, I was searching around for a while for this, so please let me know if you know where Thranduil's wife comes up in Tolkien's lore regarding Erebor and the dwarves specifically. So drop that in the comments if you know. Additionally, the next change is that Thranduil's army is nowhere near the mountain on the day of Smaug's attack. I didn't include this as a timeline or location change, but it kind of is both, because it makes no sense that Thranduil just happened to be there with thousands of elves on the exact day that Smaug attacked. It was a multiple-day journey between their kingdoms, but the movie makes it seem like it all happened in one day. After all, it's as Thorin is running out of the mountain that he looks up and sees the Elven King. And speaking of Thorin, that brings us to the final error with this flashback, because we learn from Thorin himself in the book that he wasn't in the mountain on the day of the attack, which explains his survival. He says that in his younger years, he was adventurous, and he, along with some other dwarves, were out exploring in the woods on that day, and they saw the dragon land on top of the mountain and send everything up in flames. So no, he was not there, and therefore this entire sequence, including him, is made up. Now, moving on past this flashback, the next thing we see in the movie is a brief cameo from Elijah Wood as Frodo, and it helps connect this moment to the beginning of the Lord of the Rings trilogy. It's a fun scene, and I personally like the connection, but as you might have guessed, the book doesn't include this at all. The first chapter starts much simpler by describing hobbits and hobbit holes, and then giving a brief history of the Bagginses themselves, and more importantly, a history of Belladonna Took, Bilbo's mother, and his connection to a more adventurous spirit. But now that the preamble is over with, the real story begins, as the movie finally gets to young Bilbo sitting and smoking in front of Bag End. And I should say younger Bilbo because he is still about 50 years old, but he's not 111. Anyway, a small change but impactful to understanding Bilbo himself is the fact that in the book, he is way more welcoming and jovial upon Gandalf's approach. When he says good morning, he actually means it. And we read that it was indeed a very nice day and Bilbo was in good spirits. In fact, Bilbo eventually even invites Gandalf to sit and smoke with him, offering to share his own pipeweed. Although he is wary of the traveler, Book Bilbo still has the heart of a hobbit, which is welcoming and hospitable to most strangers. And we'll see more of this as the dwarves start arriving the next day. In addition to Bilbo's invite to smoke, the movie leaves out another crucial invite he extends to Gandalf to join him for tea the following day. He very clearly turns down the invite to adventure, but in an awkward attempt to end the conversation, he blurts out that Gandalf is welcome to tea the following day, and then he hurriedly goes inside Bag End to escape the conversation. Even a hobbit's hospitality can grow thin, and especially after the mention of an adventure. But this invite gives us more context for the following day when the doorbell rings and Bilbo believes it to be Gandalf, because it rings right at tea time. But before we get to the dwarves' arrival, we have another change regarding an extended edition scene, which shows Bilbo going to the market and getting a fish for his dinner. He is paranoid about potentially seeing Gandalf and even asks another hobbit if they've seen the wizard. This is a funny little extended edition scene, but A, it doesn't happen in the book, and B, it wouldn't happen anyway because we read that the next day Bilbo had forgotten about Gandalf entirely. In fact, he didn't remember the wizard or the invite he gave him to tea until his bell rang right at tea time. And on that note, we can move into the arrival of our 13 dwarves. Something I want you to focus on as we go throughout these changes is Bilbo's personality and attitude about everything that happens to him. We've already seen a slight difference in his demeanor as he interacted with Gandalf and even invited him to smoke and to tea, but these next few changes regarding the dwarves' dinner will show just how different our book Bilbo is from the movie. And the first example of this comes when the dwarves begin to eat. In the movie, it is much more the dwarves getting food, with Bilbo running around yelling at them the whole time. But in the book, it's quite the opposite. In fact, as each dwarf arrives, Bilbo takes their orders for food and drink and continues to bring them stuff, even cooking for them. We even read one part during the chaos in which Bilbo thinks to himself that he knows his role as the host, and he will feed the entire company of dwarves even if it means he has to go without eating himself, which one, that's huge for a hobbit, and two, that's crazy considering he didn't even know he was going to be supplying dinner that night. This is a true representation of hobbit hospitality, and it doesn't reflect the same on screen. Movie Bilbo is reluctant to even give up one single meal to Dwalin. Let alone when the rest of the dwarves show up, he is running around telling them to put things back and to stop what they're doing. Now, I actually really enjoy Martin Freeman in these movies, and he's great during this scene. And this video isn't about my opinion of the films in general. I'm merely here as an unbiased researcher, so you can draw conclusions for yourself. But what I will say is that this completely flips Bilbo around from what he is supposed to be, and we aren't finished yet. The next change is a quick one, and that is that Thorin doesn't show up by himself later after the meal. He arrives with Gandalf and 3 other dwarves. And he actually falls through the door like they show some of the other dwarves doing in the movie. We read that after this he was grumpy with Bilbo for opening the door so abruptly, but mainly because Bombur fell on top of him. And as we all know, Bombur is gravitationally challenged. Now, before I move into the last few changes regarding their discussion of the actual adventure, I wanted to point out something that isn't a change, but I think needs to be mentioned. And that is the cleaning song of That's What Bilbo Baggins Hates. Although not all the words are identical, this song is indeed in the book, and it happens pretty much just like the movie shows. Bilbo is so swept up by their singing and moving around that he suddenly sees all the plates and things neatly stacked up without knowing what really happened. And it's key to remember that this book is written from Bilbo's perspective, so it makes sense that in typical Bilbo fashion, he would embellish things for the sake of the story. So while we may watch the scene and think poorly of it because compared to Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings trilogy, it seems too fanciful or unrealistic, it actually makes perfect sense when you read the book. It is a children's book after all, so to have dwarves tossing dishes around without breaking a single one while somehow all singing the same song in unison is accurate to what Tolkien wrote. So again, this isn't a change, but worth pointing out, as we'll have more moments like this throughout the trilogy, in which our brains will want to assume that the movie made an error, but in actuality, it is what Tolkien wrote. Now that being said, let's move on to the events after dinner, and take a look at the dwarves singing. But wait, you say, that's not until after they discuss the adventure. Well, that's the change, you see. In the book, they sing before they talk business, because Thorin says it's best to discuss dark business in the dark, and it's still a little too light out for the liking of the dwarves. So they pass the time by playing music and singing. That's right, playing music. They each fetch instruments they brought, and maybe most surprising of all, Thorin plays a golden harp. I know, Manly GQ model Thorin is master of the harp. It's great. Now, this music they play actually is key to the next change, which is all about Bilbo's attitude. Like I said, we have several instances today of Bilbo's character being changed, and this is yet another one. As the dwarves played their instruments and sang, Bilbo felt the Tookish part of him wake up and desire to go adventure. It's a moment which we never see in the movie, as movie Bilbo is consistently against the idea of being their burglar. And although in the book they haven't gotten that far in the conversation yet, Bilbo is already feeling brave and up for the journey. However, this does fluctuate as near the end of the song, he starts to imagine the horrible parts of the adventure, like dying, and he gets scared again. But the Tookish part of him doesn't fully die yet, as we'll soon see. The next change is that Bilbo doesn't pass out while reading a contract. He actually starts having a fit after Thorin begins the meeting and mentions that some of them may never return. This proves to be too much for the poor hobbit, and after realizing the severity of this meeting, Bilbo has a panic attack and they have to remove him to a different room. But the next change brings us back to Bilbo's Tookish nature, as he recovers from his fit and overhears the dwarves planning in the other room. Quite some time has passed, and he happened to overhear Gloin talking about him, saying that he's not a burglar and would be no good on the adventure. This set Bilbo off. He could put up with a lot, but he would not sit by while someone in his own home said that he was no good. So he got up, stormed into the other room, and did the unthinkable. He told them that no matter what they asked, he would do it. That's right, completely opposite to movie Bilbo, who declines Gandalf's pleas after he wakes up from fainting. In fact, in the movie, when the dwarves say that he's no burglar, Bilbo agrees, as he is very intent on not being involved. Now again, I actually enjoy movie Bilbo, but it is odd when comparing him to the book, because even in this first chapter, you begin to see the major differences in their personalities. And I wonder if that'll keep up throughout the rest of the story, or if things will balance out once the adventure begins. Now to finish up, we have 3 more changes. First, after Gandalf reveals the map, Thorin seems not so surprised by a side entrance, but more so worried that Smaug would have found this secret passage already. But Gandalf tells him that Smaug wouldn't be able to fit, as it would be quite a small door. Thorin then turns and asks Bilbo for his suggestions, almost testing him as a burglar, and Bilbo asks for more details. So Thorin gives him the story of Smaug's attack and mentions that sometime after the attack, Thror and Thrain were found in the woods, and Thorin always wondered how they got out. But now the secret passage explains things. This explanation of the story is where most of the prologue scene is pulled from, but like we discussed earlier in this video, there are quite a few differences. The second to last change is that another key part of the conversation was removed regarding how Gandalf obtained the map. Thorin is curious and presses him on this because he's almost accusatory of how the wizard came to possess a map that rightfully belongs to Thorin. Gandalf explains that he got it from Thrain, who he found in the captivity of the necromancer. Thrain's mind had already gone, and Gandalf didn't even learn Thorin's name, so it took him a while to find the dwarf so he could give him the map. This part of the book also further reinforces just how long it has been, as Gandalf says that Thorin hasn't seen his father for 100 years. And finally, the last difference between the movie and the first chapter of the book is that the movie omitted the final part of the night as they head to bed and Bilbo took each of the dwarves' breakfast orders. By this point though, many hours had passed, and Bilbo's tookishness had worn off. He decided in his own mind that he wouldn't bother getting up and fixing them all breakfast, and he was quite certain that he wouldn't be going on any adventure the next day. And that is where the chapter ends. But of course, we know that's not quite how things will end up. And that wraps up every difference between the book and movie for episode 1 of Movies vs. Manuscripts, the Hobbit Edition. If you're new here and enjoyed the video, be sure to like and subscribe, and come back every other week to follow along with this adventure. I've already done this same format for the Lord of the Rings trilogy and have all of those videos in a playlist on my channel. Plus, if you like Harry Potter, I also do Movies vs. Manuscripts for that as well, and I'm about to begin The Goblet of Fire. So whether you like Middle-earth, the Wizarding World, or both, there's plenty of content here on Factor Fantasy for you. My name is Gibby, I hope you have a great week, and I'll see you in the next video.